There's a strange shift that there's a moment most people fear but few understand. A moment when you stop explaining yourself, when you stop chasing clarity, when you stop filling the silence for someone who chose not to speak. And in that quiet space, something unexpected happens. This isn't about manipulation. This isn't about games. This is about self-respect reaching a level so calm, so grounded, that it changes the dynamic without you saying a single word. Because the moment you match his silence, he starts doing things he never did before. Let's talk about what really happens in that moment, and why it's powerful. Happens when you stop reaching out, not dramatically, not with anger, just quietly. One day you don't send the follow-up message. You don't explain why you're hurt. You don't fill the space with reassurance or questions or emotional labor. You simply stop offering what you used to give freely. And at first, nothing seems to happen. The world doesn't shake. The phone doesn't light up. Life keeps moving. But inside him, something subtle starts to crack. Because access is something people rarely notice while they have it. When you were always there, always responsive, always emotionally available, your presence became part of the background of his life. Like air, necessary, but invisible. Not because he didn't care, but because certainty creates comfort, and comfort creates blindness. Human beings are wired this way. We adapt quickly to what feels stable. Psychologists call it hedonic adaptation, the tendency to normalize what is consistently present. It's why people stop noticing a beautiful view when they see it every day, or why a daily good morning text slowly turns into an expectation rather than a gift. You didn't lose value. Your value was just no longer being noticed. So when you stop showing up the same way, the first thing he feels isn't love or regret, it's confusion, a low-grade unease. Something feels off, but he can't immediately name it. His brain is registering a disruption in a pattern it relied on. Studies in behavioral psychology show that when a predictable reward is removed, the brain responds with heightened attention. In simple terms, when something you counted on disappears, you finally look for it. That's when he realizes something important. Access to you was never guaranteed. It was given, and now it's gone. Not because you announced your departure, but because you stopped making yourself endlessly available. He notices it in small moments. When something happens in his day and his first instinct is to tell you, but then he hesitates. When he checks his phone and doesn't see your name. When he realizes hours or days have passed without hearing from you, and no explanation was offered. Silence does something words can't. It forces awareness. Real life works this way more often than people admit. Think about a friend who always plans the get-togethers, always checks in, always makes the effort. Everyone appreciates them until they stop, and suddenly the group feels different. Not because the friend was loud or demanding, but because they were holding something together that no one noticed until it wasn't there anymore. You were holding emotional space, listening, understanding, adjusting, waiting. When you stop, he feels the loss not as drama, but as absence. And absence is powerful. What's important here is that this isn't about punishment. It's not about teaching him a lesson. It's about the natural consequence of withdrawing access that was never supposed to be unconditional, at the cost of your self-respect. When someone gets used to you always being available, they unconsciously stop investing in maintaining that connection. Not because they're cruel, but because the human mind prioritizes what feels at risk. Loss sharpens perception, and for the first time he begins to sense risk. He starts replaying moments where he assumed you'd be there, messages he didn't respond to right away, conversations he postponed, times he thought, I'll deal with this later, because later always seemed available. Those moments take on new weight, not because you brought them up, but because silence gives them room to echo. There's also something deeper happening. When access is removed, the ego takes a hit. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, unsettling way. He was used to being someone who could reach you, someone whose presence triggered a response. When that response disappears, the question arises, did I lose something I thought I owned? And that's a hard realization, because no one likes discovering that what they took for granted was never guaranteed. Research on interpersonal dynamics shows that people often equate responsiveness with interest, and interest with security. When responsiveness disappears, the sense of security collapses. He doesn't just miss you, He misses the version of himself that felt certain of your availability. That's why the loss of access feels personal. This is where many people make a mistake. They break the silence too early, they explain themselves, they rush to clarify, and in doing so they restore access before its absence has had time to be fully felt. But when you stay grounded, when you don't chase or justify, the silence completes its work. He begins to understand that your presence was a choice, not a default, and that understanding changes things. You see it when his messages, if they come, sound different, less casual, more intentional. You see it in the way he tries to re-enter the space carefully, testing whether the door is still open. That's not manipulation on your part, that's respect being recalibrated. But here's the most important part, and it's the part that often gets overlooked. While he's processing the loss of access to you, you're reclaiming access to yourself. You stop organizing your day around his responses. You stop measuring your worth by how quickly someone gets back to you. You stop holding emotional space for someone who wasn't fully present. And something shifts inside, you too. Neuroscience tells us that emotional detachment from a draining pattern lowers cortisol levels. In simple terms, when you stop overgiving, your nervous system begins to calm down. You think more clearly, you breathe more deeply. You remember who you were before your energy was constantly directed outward. That calm isn't indifference, it's self-alignment, and people feel that. Even if he never consciously names it, he senses the difference. You're no longer reaching from a place of need. You're standing in a place of balance. And balance is unsettling to anyone who benefited from imbalance. This is why matching his silence works, not as a tactic, but as a byproduct of self-respect. You didn't become cold. You became still. You didn't withdraw love. You withdrew excess access. And in that space, truth emerges. He learns what your presence actually meant. You learn that you don't disappear when someone stops reaching. You're still here, whole, grounded, intact. That's the moment everything begins to change. Not because someone finally notices your absence, but because you stop abandoning yourself to be noticed. There comes a point when silence stops being empty and starts becoming heavy. Not loud, not dramatic, just present. And when you stop reacting the way you used to, when you stop filling every gap with reassurance or emotion or explanation, something shifts inside him. It's subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. But over time it grows into a discomfort he can't ignore. Because what disappears in that moment isn't just your words, it's the fuel his ego had been quietly living on. Ego doesn't always look like arrogance. Sometimes it looks like comfort. The comfort of knowing you'll respond. The comfort of knowing you'll care. The comfort of knowing that no matter how little effort is given, there will still be attention waiting on the other side. Attention, especially emotional attention, is powerful. Neurologists have shown that social validation activates the same reward centers in the brain as physical pleasure. Being seen, being reacted to, being important enough to trigger an emotional response, these things create a quiet high. And for a long time, without realizing it, he was receiving that high from you. Every time you explained how you felt, every time you checked in after being ignored, every time you softened your truth to keep the peace, none of it was wrong. It came from care. But it fed something that never had to work for itself. When you stop reacting, the first thing that disappears is that steady stream of validation, no instant reassurance, no emotional feedback, no proof that he still has influence over your inner world. At first, he might interpret your silence as distraction. Maybe you're busy, maybe you're tired, but as the silence stretches, a deeper realization begins to form. He is no longer at the center of your emotional attention, and for the ego, that's destabilizing. Psychologists describe this as a disruption of perceived importance. When someone is used to being a focal point in another person's emotional landscape, the removal of that focus creates anxiety. Not because of love alone, but because of identity. If he was used to being the one who matters in your reactions, your silence forces him to confront a version of himself that is no longer mirrored back by you. Ego needs reflection to survive, and you stopped reflecting it. This is where many people get confused. They think silence is passive, weak, but silence, when it comes from self-respect, is one of the most active forces there is. It removes reinforcement. And when reinforcement disappears, behavior changes. This isn't opinion. It's behavioral science. Actions that are no longer rewarded naturally decrease. Emotional neglect of your own boundaries was being rewarded by his sense of importance. When that reward stops, the system resets. He starts questioning himself, not in a dramatic, movie scene way, in small, quiet thoughts. Why isn't she reacting? Did I say something wrong? Did I push too far? The ego doesn't like unanswered questions, especially when they threaten its position, so it searches for answers. And when it can't find them externally, it turns inward. That's when real awareness begins. There's a moment many people experience but rarely talk about. It's the moment you send a message and don't get the reaction you expected. Not anger, not affection, just neutrality. That neutral space can feel colder than rejection because it doesn't confirm anything. It doesn't reassure the ego that it still holds power. Your calm becomes a mirror he can't control. In real life, this happens all the time. Think about a workplace where one person always laughs at the boss's jokes, always agrees, always validates. If that person suddenly stops reacting, the boss notices. Not because they lost laughter, but because they lost confirmation. Confirmation that they matter. Confirmation that their presence has impact. That's what your silence does. It removes confirmation. And without confirmation, the ego begins to shrink. This is when his behavior may start to shift. He might try to provoke a reaction, a casual message, a sudden check-in, something designed to test whether he can still access your emotional world. Not necessarily out of malice, but out of uncertainty. The ego wants proof that it still exists in your attention. But when you don't react the way you used to, something important happens. You're no longer easy to predict. And unpredictability forces respect. What's powerful here is that you didn't become cold. You didn't become cruel. You simply stopped overfunctioning emotionally. You stopped carrying the weight of both sides of the connection. And that rebalancing exposes how much emotional labor you were doing alone. Silence reveals imbalance, and ego thrives on imbalance. When the balance shifts, he feels it. He may not have the language for it, but he feels smaller in your world. And that feeling can lead in two directions. Some people rise to the moment. They reflect. They adjust. They show up with more presence because they realize attention must be earned, not assumed. Others resist. They pull away. They protect their ego rather than examine it. Either way, your silence does something essential. It removes you from the role of emotional supplier. And here's where the transformation truly begins, inside you. When you stop feeding his ego, you stop starving yourself. You reclaim energy that was being spent monitoring his moods, anticipating his needs, and managing his reactions. Neuroscience tells us that constantly anticipating another person's emotional state keeps the brain in a heightened stress response. When you stop, your nervous system begins to regulate. You feel steadier, clearer, less reactive. That calm is not detachment from care, it's attachment to self, and self-attached people move differently. They don't rush to be understood. They don't beg for clarity. They don't over-explain their worth. They stand in it. And that stance quietly communicates something words never could. Your attention is no longer automatic. It is selective. It is grounded. It is valuable. When ego stops being fed, truth has space to breathe. He may finally see you not as someone who will always be there no matter what, but as someone who chooses to be there when mutual respect exists. That realization can be uncomfortable. But discomfort is often the doorway to growth. And even if he never fully understands what changed, you do. You stopped reacting. You stopped proving. You stopped pouring into a space that wasn't holding you. And in doing so, you didn't lose power. You reclaimed it. Silence has a way of slowing time down. When the noise fades, when the back and forth stops, when there's no reaction waiting on the other side, the mind does something it avoid. When everything is loud, it turns inward. And that's when he begins to replay his actions. Not because you asked him to, not because you demanded answers, but because silence leaves him alone with himself. At first, the quiet feels temporary to him. He assumes it will pass. He assumes you'll speak soon, explain something, clarify something, reach out like you always did. That assumption gives him comfort for a while. But when the silence stretches, when it becomes clear that you're not rushing to fill the gap, the comfort dissolves. What replaces it is thought, real thought, unavoidable thought. The human brain is wired to seek resolution. When a pattern breaks, the mind goes searching for meaning. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the discomfort that arises when reality doesn't match expectation. He expected access. He expected reaction. He expected emotional continuity. Your silence disrupts all of it. And so the replay begins. He thinks back to the last conversation, the tone, the timing, what he said, what he didn't say. He remembers moments that seemed small at the time but now feel heavier. The message he left on read. The time he changed the subject when you opened up. The joke he made instead of listening. At the time, none of it felt urgent. Now, in the absence of your voice, those moments echo. This isn't guilt yet, it's awareness. Neuroscience shows that when external stimulation decreases, the brain increases internal processing. In simple terms, when you stop providing emotional input, the mind starts reviewing stored memories. That's why silence can feel so loud. It forces reflection. And reflection doesn't move fast. He might tell himself stories at first, that you're busy, that you're fine, that this doesn't mean anything. But as time passes, those stories lose strength. Because deep down, he knows something shifted. And when the end can't blame external noise, it turns toward behavior. This is where the replay becomes personal. He remembers how you used to respond quickly, how you used to ask questions, how you used to care enough to follow up. And then he notices the contrast. The absence of that energy makes him realize how much of it came from you. Not from the situation, not from convenience, from effort he didn't always match. In real life, this happens more often than people admit. Think about someone who leaves a job. Not dramatically. They don't make a speech. They just leave. At first, everyone thinks things will be fine. But then the gaps start to show. Tasks they handled quietly begin to pile up. Problems they solved before anyone noticed now sit unresolved. And suddenly, people start saying, I didn't realize how much they did. That's what your silence does. It exposes contribution through absence. He starts replaying moments not because he wants to suffer, but because his mind is trying to understand the loss. Humans are loss-oriented creatures. Studies show that loss has a stronger psychological impact than gain. We feel the absence of something more intensely than we ever felt its presence. That's why he's thinking now when he wasn't before. He might lie awake longer at night. He might find himself distracted during the day. Not because he's overwhelmed with emotion, but because unresolved questions linger. Silence doesn't give answers, it demands them. And here's the part most people don't see. As he replays his actions, he also replays your reactions, or rather, the lack of them. He remembers how you used to explain yourself, and now he notices that you don't. He remembers how you used to push for clarity, and now you don't. That contrast forces a realization that's hard to avoid. You changed, and change invites examination. He wonders when it happened. What moment shifted something inside you? Was it one conversation, or many small ones? Was it something he did, or something he didn't do? These questions circle because silence doesn't interrupt them. It lets them run their course. This is where accountability quietly enters the room. Not the kind that comes from being accused, the kind that comes from being left alone with your own behavior. Behavioral research shows that people are more likely to take responsibility when they arrive at conclusions themselves, rather than being told what they did wrong. Silence creates that space. You didn't lecture, you didn't argue. You stepped back, and in that space his mind connects dots on its own. He starts to see patterns, how often you initiated, how often you adjusted, how often you waited, and how often he assumed. Assumption is easy when someone is always there. Reflection is harder when they're not. This doesn't mean he immediately becomes a different person. Growth is rarely instant. Sometimes the replay leads to regret. Sometimes it leads to defensiveness. Sometimes it leads to excuses. But the important thing is this, he is no longer unaware. Silence removes ignorance. And while he's replaying his actions, something equally important is happening inside you. You're no longer replaying his. You stop revisiting conversations in your head, wondering what you should have said differently. You stop rehearsing explanations that were never fully received. You stop questioning whether you asked for too much when all you wanted was presence. The energy shifts inward. And that shift is grounding. When you stop explaining yourself, you regain mental clarity. Neuroscientists note that rumination decreases when people stop seeking external validation for emotional experiences. In simpler terms, when you stop trying to be understood by someone who isn't listening, why? Our mind becomes quieter. That quiet strengthens you, and strength changes how you carry yourself. Even if he doesn't consciously understand why, he senses that you're no longer stuck in the same emotional loop. You're no longer replaying. You're living. And that contrast makes his replay feel heavier by comparison. He's stuck in the past while you're present. That's when the dynamic truly shifts. The replay continues because silence doesn't rush resolution. It allows truth to surface slowly, honestly, without pressure. And sometimes the truth he sees isn't just about you, it's about himself, about how he handles closeness, about how he responds to consistency, about how he treats what feels safe. That kind of realization doesn't come from arguments, it comes from space. And space is what you gave, not as a strategy, not as a game, but as an act of self-respect. You didn't disappear to be chased, you stepped back to breathe. And in that breathing room, he finally had nothing to do but look at his own footsteps and ask himself where he started walking differently. Silence didn't change him, it gave him the chance to see himself. And whether he chooses to grow from that reflection or turn away from it, one truth remains unshaken. You didn't lose your voice. You chose not to waste it where it wasn't being heard. When someone finally reaches out after silence, it rarely sounds the way it used to. The words may be familiar, but the energy behind them is not. There's a pause now, a hesitation, a carefulness that wasn't there before. And that difference tells you everything you need to know, because when silence has done its work, it doesn't just bring someone back, it changes how they come back. At first, he may not even realize what he's doing. He opens the message thread, types something casual, deletes it, then types again. The ease he once felt is gone. Before, reaching out was automatic. He assumed a response, assumed warmth, assumed continuity. Now, he's aware that something has shifted. Awareness changes behavior. Psychologists talk about this in terms of perceived risk. When there is no risk, people act casually. When risk appears, they become intentional. Your silence introduced risk, not of rejection, but of uncertainty. And uncertainty forces mindfulness. So when he reaches out, it's different. The message might be shorter, but it carries weight. Or longer, more thoughtful, less playful than before. He may ask how you are instead of telling you about himself. He may reference something meaningful instead of starting with a joke. These are not accidents. They are signs that he understands, even if only subconsciously, that access to you is no longer guaranteed. This is what happens when someone realizes they might have taken something for granted. In everyday life, you see this all the time. Think about a friend you drifted from, not because of conflict, but because effort slowly faded. When you finally reach out after a long silence, you don't just say, hey, you think about what to say. You choose your words. You acknowledge the distance without naming it. That's respect returning through awareness. That's what's happening here. He is no longer messaging from a place of assumption. He is messaging from a place of consideration. And consideration is the beginning of change. Before, his communication may have been reactive. He responded when it was convenient. He reached out when he wanted something. Attention, reassurance, closeness on his terms. Now there's an attempt to meet you where you are. Not perfectly, not always consistently, but differently. Attachment research shows that when a relational dynamic shifts, people often adjust their behavior to restore balance. When you stopped overgiving, imbalance became visible, and in response, he begins to offer more. Not because you demanded it, but because the system corrected itself. You can feel this difference immediately. There's a softness in his tone, a patience in his timing, a humility in his words. Even if he doesn't say, I'm sorry, the effort speaks. Effort always does. What's important here is that you don't rush to fill the old role again. You don't over-respond. You don't explain what the silence meant. You stay where you are, grounded, calm, present, because the way someone reaches out after silence tells you how much they've learned from it. And the way you respond tells them how much access still requires intention. This is where many people undo their own growth. They're so relieved to be contacted that they immediately revert. They flood the space with emotion, availability, reassurance, and in doing so, they remove the very thing that created the shift. But when you stay steady, something deeper happens. He starts mirroring your energy. He waits for your response instead of expecting it. He listens more carefully. He becomes more aware of how his words land. This isn't manipulation, it's emotional recalibration. Social neuroscience shows that humans naturally synchronize with the emotional tone of those they care about. When you are calm and self-contained, that calm sets the rhythm. When you are no longer anxious for connection, connection becomes more respectful. And that respect changes everything. He may begin to ask questions he never asked before, not out of interrogation, but out of genuine curiosity. He may acknowledge things he brushed past in the past. He may take responsibility in small ways, being on time, following through, checking in without being prompted. These are quiet signals, but they matter, because real change rarely announces itself loudly. It shows up in consistency. At the same time, something shifts inside him that he may not fully articulate. He realizes that connection with you now requires presence. Not just physical presence, but emotional presence. And emotional presence demands effort. The kind of effort that only appears when someone understands that what they're engaging with has value. Silence taught that lesson without speaking. But the most powerful transformation in this phase isn't his. It's yours. You're no longer waiting to be reached. You're no longer holding your breath for a message. You're no longer defining your day by someone else's response time. You're responding from choice, not need. And that choice gives you clarity. You begin to notice things you didn't before, how he shows up when he does, whether his effort is consistent or temporary, whether his words align with his actions. Silence sharpened your awareness, and awareness protects you. You're no longer impressed by words alone. You're paying attention to energy, to follow through, to how you feel in the connection. You notice whether conversations leave you calm or drained, whether you feel seen or managed. This isn't guardedness, it's discernment, and discernment changes how people interact with you. When he reaches out differently, it's because he senses that you're no longer operating from the same place. You're not chasing closeness. You're allowing it, and allowing requires trust in yourself first. Even if the connection doesn't return to what it was, something important has already been reclaimed. Your time, your energy, your emotional space. You're no longer available to dynamics that require you to shrink or overextend, and that makes any connection that remains more honest. Reaching out differently isn't just about him trying harder, it's about him recognizing that what he's reaching for has boundaries now, and boundaries don't push people away. They show people how to stay. Silence didn't close the door. It changed the way it's opened. There's a quiet turning point that happens long after the messages slow down and the silence settles in. It's not dramatic. No sudden realization. No movie scene clarity. Slower than that. Softer. One day you wake up and notice that your chest doesn't feel as tight anymore. Your thoughts aren't racing towards someone else's behavior. You're not rehearsing conversations in your head or checking your phone the moment it lights up. Something inside you has shifted, and for the first time in a long while, your life feels like it belongs to you again. This is the part people rarely talk about. Everyone focuses on what he does when you step back. Whether he reaches out, whether he changes, whether he understands. But the real transformation happens when you stop centering your emotional world around someone else's reactions. Because the moment you do that, you begin to reclaim yourself, regardless of what he chooses. At first, it feels unfamiliar. You're used to monitoring tone, timing, silence, used to adjusting your energy to keep the connection alive. When that stops, there's space. And space can feel uncomfortable before it feels peaceful. Your mind doesn't know what to do with all the attention that's no longer being spent outward, so it turns inward. You start noticing things. How much of your day used to be shaped by anticipation. How often your mood depended on a response. How quickly you abandoned your own needs to maintain closeness. None of this comes with self-judgment, just awareness. And awareness is powerful because it doesn't demand change, it invites it. Neuroscience tells us that when we stop seeking external validation, the brain's reward system slowly recalibrates. Dopamine stops spiking from messages and reassurance, and instead begins to stabilize around self-directed goals. That's why you start feeling calmer, more focused, more present. You're no longer riding emotional highs and lows dictated by someone else's availability. You're standing on your own ground, and from that ground you begin to remember who were before you tried so hard to be understood, the parts of you that laughed easily, the parts that didn't overthink every word, the parts that trusted themselves without needing confirmation. You don't become closed off, you become clear. Clarity changes how you move through the world. You stop chasing conversations that leave you drained. You stop explaining feelings to people who minimize them. You stop offering access to parts of yourself that deserve care and respect. This isn't bitterness, it's discernment. The kind that comes from finally listening to your own nervous system. And something unexpected happens. Even if he does come back, apologetic, thoughtful, trying, you're different now. You're no longer waiting to be chosen. You're observing, you're feeling into whether the connection aligns with who you are becoming. You're asking yourself questions you never asked before. Does this feel safe? Does this feel mutual? Do I feel like myself here? Those questions are signs of growth. In real life, this happens when someone leaves a situation that consumed them, a job, a relationship, a role they outgrew. At first, there's emptiness, then there's clarity, then there's a quiet confidence that says, I survived without what I thought I needed. That confidence doesn't shout, it doesn't prove, it simply exists, and people feel it. Whether he notices it consciously or not, he senses that you're no longer tethered to his actions, that your world doesn't collapse or expand based on his presence. That kind of independence isn't threatening, it's grounding. It tells the truth without saying a word. Connection with you is no longer fueled by fear of loss, but by choice. Choice changes everything. Because when you choose instead of cling, you don't abandon yourself to keep someone else comfortable. You don't negotiate your worth for consistency. You don't stay lent to avoid conflict or speak just to keep attention. You act from alignment, and alignment is magnetic. Even if he walks away completely, something sacred remains intact. You, your peace, your sense of self. You don't lose yourself trying to hold on to someone who wasn't fully present. You don't shrink your voice to keep the quiet. You don't confuse effort with love anymore. You learn that love, real love, doesn't require you to disappear. There's a strength that comes from realizing you can stand alone without hardening your heart, that you can be soft without being self-sacrificing, that you can care deeply and still walk away from what doesn't meet you with the same depth. That strength doesn't look like control. It looks like calm. And calm is powerful. Calm doesn't chase explanations. Calm doesn't beg for closure. Calm doesn't need to be loud to be felt. Calm trusts that what's meant to meet you will do so without you breaking yourself open to make space. When you reclaim yourself, the outcome stops defining you, whether he grows or doesn't, whether he stays or leaves, whether he understands or never does. Your worth no longer hangs in that balance. And that freedom is the real victory. Because you were never meant to be someone who waits in emotional limbo. You were meant to live fully, speak honestly, and give your energy where it's returned with care. You don't need silence to punish, you don't need distance to manipulate, you need alignment to protect your spirit. And once you have that, everything else becomes optional. You're no longer asking, what will he do? You're asking, what do I want? And that question changes the direction of your life. Not loudly, not all at once, but permanently. Silence isn't weakness, it's clarity without noise. And the moment you stop filling every gap with effort, emotion, and explanation, the world responds differently. Sometimes he steps forward, sometimes he steps back. But you stand still, centered, unshaken. And that's the moment everything truly changes.